Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to what promises to be a very interesting event, and we are delighted you were able to join us for it. It is a 2020, which is a very visionary year, a very 2020 interfaith dialogue, rediscovering one another, and interfaith discussion on human dignity. This discussion is taking place in a very important place. It is in the nation's capital, Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, and it is at the beautiful congregation synagogue Machzikei Hadas. It's very hard to pronounce, but it's very easy to wonderfully love. What it means, Machzikei Hadas, is the upholders of the faith. This is a place that I know very well. It's beautiful because it was constructed about 50 years ago, and it is new now as it was then. It's probably in better shape now than it was because it's being used so well for so many important things, including this great panel which you're going to enjoy. And it is my great pleasure to introduce the introducer. And he is none other than the person who has become a very good personal friend over the course of many years. He lived in Ottawa for a while, then he snuck out in the middle of the night a little while ago to become the director of the Sheptytsky Institute in the University of Toronto. He's since retired, but he's still as active now as he was then. Good friend, Father Peter Galazza.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Bolka, for that very, very kind introduction. And before we proceed, I'd like to express my gratitude, express the gratitude of all of us to Mary Lissick, who is the lead organizer for the Interfaith events of the Capital Ukrainian Festival. So the Capital Ukrainian Festival believes not only in showcasing the Ukrainian heritage, but also connecting with other cultures to strengthen our shared communities. And those of you who know the festival culture here in Ottawa realize that one of the great things about Ottawa is that whether you go to a Greek festival or a Lebanese festival, or in this case a Ukrainian festival, you are going to connect with people, groups, dancers, speakers from other cultural groups. So it's a wonderful thing about Ottawa, which really displays what it means to live in a multicultural Canada. So without further ado, let me introduce to you our esteemed panelists. And from let's see, what are you? Are you your left to right? Yes, very good. Okay. So from here at my immediate left, we have a very beloved individual in this congregation of Machzikei Hadas, Rabbi Eden Sher, who's been the chief rabbi here for several years now. Rabbi Sher earned an undergraduate degree from Yeshiva Sha'ar HaTorah in New York, a master's degree in Talmudic law from the Ner Israel Rabbinical College in Baltimore, and an MA in Public Policy and Management from Johns Hopkins University. He holds rabbinic ordination from both Rabbi Zalman Nehemiah Goldberg, the director of the Jerusalem Rabbinical Court, and from Rabbi Gedalia Schwartz, the director of the Beth Din of America. Rabbi Sher also studied at Yeshivas Brisk in Jerusalem, where he was a student of Rabbi Shalom Schechter. Rabbi Sher's work is grounded within the Jewish community, but also extends beyond in his work as a Jewish liaison to Ottawa's other faith communities. Rabbi Sher's input and thoughts are highly sought after by both the news media and leading politicians here in North America. He frequently represents the community in multi-faith platforms. He chairs an interfaith panel for federal government and private business workshops, just to name a few of his activities. Rabbi Sher and his wife Shifra just welcomed their third child, their daughter Shaina Yonina. Did I pronounce Shaina? Is it Shaina?
Yeah, Shaina.
Shaina Yonina. So, mazel tov to you.
Thank you.
Rabbi Sher, and to your lovely wife. Next we have Imam Sikander Hashmi. This Montreal native, Imam Sikander Hashmi, left home at the age of 11 to embark on a decade-long study of Islam. He graduated in 2004 from North America's first Islamic Seminary in Cornwall, Ontario. Imam Sikandar Hashmi went on to study journalism at Concordia University and recently completed his Master in Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership at Carleton University. He has worked as a reporter for the Toronto Star and Montreal Gazette and served as Imam of the Islamic Center of Kingston. Since 2014, Imam Hashmi has been serving as Imam of the Canada Muslim Association and is a member of the Canadian Council of Imams as well as the Council of Imams of Ottawa-Gatineau. For those of you who are not familiar with our geography, since I just realized we're broadcasting this throughout the world, Kanata is a suburb of Ottawa. I think people in Canada don't mind being referred to as a suburb of Ottawa.
I don't know.
I think that's the most appropriate description of the wonderful town, by the way. And last but not least is Father Deacon Andrew Bennett. The Reverend Dr. Andrew Bennett holds a PhD in politics from the University of Edinburgh, as well as degrees in history from McGill and Dalhousie universities. He served as Canada's first ambassador for religious freedom and head of the Office of Religious Freedom from 2013 to 2016, during which time he led in defending and championing religious freedom internationally as a core element of Canada's foreign policy. At the same time, he served as Canada's head of delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, a 31-country body which leads international efforts in Holocaust education, research, and remembrance. Father Deacon Bennett is currently director of the Cardis Religious Freedom Institute. He is an ordained deacon in the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church in the Eparchy or Diocese of Toronto and Eastern Canada. And so, without further ado, let's begin our dialogue, which has been entitled Rediscovering One Another, an interfaith discussion on human dignity. And I have 6 questions that I'm going to ask our panelists to deal with, and each one of them will have 5 minutes to respond sequentially to the question that I pose, so we'll have 15 minutes in total for each question. And we're going to start on the other side of the room here with Deacon Andrew. So the first question I want to pose to you, and as I say, you will then get a chance to respond. I'm sure you also respond to the same question. Could you, Deacon Andrew, briefly describe how your faith tradition understands who we are as human beings and what it is that gives us dignity?
Well, thank you very much, Father Peter. And again, it's just let me begin by saying it's wonderful to be here again at Maxim Kadas with my good friend Rabbi Sher and also with Imam Sikandar. I think this is going to be a very good discussion. I think we'll find a lot of commonalities, but also it's good to highlight differences in approach and to understand how that enriches our approach to this important question of human dignity. As a Christian, as a Catholic, Orthodox Christian of the Byzantine tradition, I think that we have to begin at the beginning when we talk about human dignity, and that is at the creation of all things, of the universe, of the world, of all creatures, and of humanity. In each human person has been implanted the divine image and likeness. As Christians across all Christian traditions, we accept that humans are created in the image and likeness of God. And this is certainly something that I think we all share, all three of us here. But how do we understand that image and likeness? If we read from the Second Vatican Council, a very important document, Gaudium et Spes, which talks about these fundamental questions about who we are and how we engage with the world. There is this question of the divine image and likeness, the image and likeness of God, so that there is something, as Gaudium et Spes says, there's something of the glory of God that shines on the face of every person. And that is really at the core of what gives us dignity as human beings. St. Paul VI famously said, the dignity of every person before God is the basis of the dignity of human beings before each other. So we understand who we are as human beings in our relationship to God, but also fundamentally in our relationship to one another. Because in one another, we see ourselves, but we also see, at a much more profound level, this image and likeness of God. Now, what distinguishes us as Christians about this question of human dignity? That image and likeness of God, for us as Christians, is revealed in the person of Jesus Christ. The God-man. God who becomes man, takes on human flesh. And the incarnation, this taking on of human flesh by the Son of God, by Jesus Christ, reveals to us the fullness of this image and likeness. Because as Christians, we believe that Jesus Christ is perfect God and perfect man. He restores human nature. He restores to us that image and likeness that was marred by what we refer to as the fall. What we read about in Genesis, the story of Adam and Eve, the garden, and humanity's fall from grace and exile. We're restored to that through Jesus Christ. He shows us what it means to be God by rising from the dead, ascending into heaven. But he also shows us what it means to be human by experiencing life as human, by suffering a very human death, full of pain and suffering on the cross. So, in Christ, we are called to see the fullness of who we are and who we can become. And we are called to see in one another, everyone, not just Christians, every single person that we encounter, the image and likeness of God through Christ, through that understanding that we have in Jesus Christ. And we are called in Christ towards a particular goal. It's not simply enough just to exist as a human being, but the dignity that we have as human beings calls us to something, and that is ultimately union with God. And so we refer to this process as the goal as being theosis, this union with God. God, in taking on flesh, in Jesus Christ, allows us to be co-heirs and to be one with God. What he is in his essence, his godness, we are able to participate through what we refer to as grace. So every human being has an end and a purpose, and our dignity leads us in that direction. But in this life, as we encounter one another, we must also celebrate that human unity that we have. And I'll get into that hopefully a little bit later.
Thank you so much. So, Imam, I'm just going to repeat the question just in case. So we're asking all three of you to briefly describe your respective faith traditions' understanding of who we are as human beings and what it is that gives us dignity. And I was very impressed that from Andrew, despite the fact that he belongs to the Byzantine tradition, which is noted for its prolixity, that we tend to have very long worded prayers, etc. He miraculously, without me even reminding him, kept it to 5 minutes. So I'm not suggesting that I'm going to want to ask you to curtail your remarks, but if you do see me after about 5 minutes fidgeting, you'll know that that's because we'd like to be able to get through the entire program today. So please, Scott.
Certainly. Thank you very much, Brother Peter. And it's always my preference to kind of be brief, at least when it comes to prayers. So I'm sort of known for that. So I'll try to do that here as well. This question about who we are and what our who we are directly relates to what our purpose is. Because if we don't know who we are, then we don't know what we're here for and what we're supposed to be doing here, really, on Earth. So we get that answer, of course, as Muslims, as people of faith, we look primarily, first of all, for the answer in the words of God. And we find two very clear statements. The first one, God tells us that He has bestowed honor upon Bani Adam in Arabic, upon the children of Adam. This is very interesting because it doesn't say that God has bestowed honor upon the believers or the people of piety or the people of knowledge. It says upon all the children of Adam, which includes all of us, of course. So we learn from that inherently we have been gifted with honor, have been granted honor by God. And I know that there is discussion between the word dignity versus honor, what that entails, especially in this context. But I'm sort of going to use them interchangeably because the way we see it, we are created by God. We did not come to be by ourselves. And therefore, God inherently being the king and the creator has the authority to give inherent honor and dignity to whomsoever he wishes. And in this case, he has clearly said that it is for all the children of Adam. And at the end of that verse also, we also learn that God is telling us that He has actually given us that honor and dignity above pretty much all the other, or the exact wording is kathir, so many of the creations of God. So we learn that we have a very special status amongst the creatures of God that's made. And when it comes to our purpose, we find a very clear statement that we have been created only for the servitude of God. Now, a lot of times that is translated as worship, and I don't like that translation because that suggests that our job is to stay in our places of worship, whether it's mosque or the synagogue or the church, and devote ourselves to constantly worshiping God and prescribe forms of worship. But servitude is much more broader. So our entire mission in life is to be of service to God, to be serving God in the many ways that we have been shown as ways of serving God, which includes pretty much everything that is good and that is pleasing to God. So inherently the human being is, by virtue of being this special creature that has been blessed with intellect and perfect form and beautiful form and so many other blessings of God, inherently makes us deserving of honor and dignity regardless of who we are. And that is a fundamental value that is intrinsic to human beings, regardless of who they are or what they happen to believe.
Thank you very, very much, Imam Sikander, for those very, very insightful comments. And we now move on to our host here, Rabbi Eden Sher, who's going to share with us the perspective from the Jewish tradition.
Okay, so I'm just going to share a couple of quick ideas. One is going to be continuing off of what Father Deacon Bennett just shared about us being created in the image of God, which is one of the earliest verses in the Torah, in the Torah, in the Hebrew Bible. And actually, in the Jewish tradition, when it talks about us being created in the image of God, that's actually a call to be like God, to create ourselves in the image of God. Just as God is merciful, so should we be merciful. Just as God is kind, so should we be. And then you think about another verse in the Torah, again, right in the creation story. And as it's describing God giving life to Adam, it says, "Vayipach ba'apav nishmat chayim," which is Hebrew for God blowing into Adam a living soul, a nishmat chayim, a living soul. And the ancient tradition of Jewish mysticism understands that verse as telling us something very specific and very profound, and that is God giving life to Adam was giving part of God into every single human being that is created, literally blowing a piece of God into each and every human being. And of course, when you think about it like that, that means every single human being is not just godly, but has that spark of God inside each one of us. What would be a greater call for dignity than looking at each human being as godly? Speaking a little bit more on what Imam Hashmi shared, I think there's another idea that's described in the Talmud, and it asks the question, why did God create the world by creating one human being? right? Why not create all the human beings together, 1 million human beings, 1 billion human beings? And the Talmud responds and explains that God created one in order to show the worth, in order to show the value of every human being. That it would have been worthwhile to create the world if only for one human being. The Hebrew words are bishvi nivra ha'olam. A person is constantly supposed to remind themselves to remain humble, but at the same time that it was for me that the world was created. We see it as God thoughtfully creating every single human being that ever has existed and ever continues to exist. And when you begin to think about human beings in that way, that they are a thoughtful creation of God, that God specifically created this person, how could that not be a call and a charge of dignity for every single person?
You have another 2 minutes, you know.
Another 2 minutes?
Yes.
I'll save it for one of the later questions.
Okay.
Yeah,
I just
put
said
it
to
in
the
my
rabbi he's got another 2 minutes, but he's going to yield his time to Imam Hashmi. So we're now going to pose the next question to you, Imam Hashmi. So we've been talking about the fact that, the three of you have been talking about the fact that there is an inherent dignity that is embedded within the human race, individuals, persons, each person in the world. And the question then is, what does that say about how we then live with one another and how we relate to one another in our broader communities? So if you could reflect for 5 minutes on that question.
And it's an interesting question, and I've been thinking about it because over, in history, we find different episodes, different instances where our respective faiths or people from or groups from within our respective faiths have had different types of interactions, different types of relationships with each other, positive and negative. And one thing that strikes me is that I'm noticing a difference between groups interacting with each other and seeing each other as groups and individuals interacting with each other as individuals. And what we find is this inherent dignity, of course, is there across the board, regardless of who the individuals are. But when it comes to interfaith relations between communities, or even within faith groups as well, in the Islamic tradition, we find very specific examples and teachings, once again, that highlight to us that regardless of what may be happening at the macro level, at the interfaith, intercommunity level, when it comes to dealing especially with individuals, there is great regard for individual rights, respect, compassion, regardless of empathy, regardless of who the individual is. We find this in the teachings with regards to, for example, being kind to your neighbor. Specific examples of the Prophet, other prophets of God, their companions, and their relations with people who did not share the same beliefs. Very interesting examples, because sometimes it appears a little bit shocking because we get so used to, a certain type of approach sometimes. As an example, relations between the Muslim minority in the very early times, the time of Prophet Muhammad in Mecca, with their polytheist neighbors, clearly weren't the best. There was great conflict and animosity. Yet even in the most critical stages, we find that the Prophet himself actually had entrusted his life essentially to someone who was not a Muslim and was a polytheist. So when it comes to, what I'm essentially saying is that there are things that we have experienced as communities, as faiths, But we must never lose sight of the fact that we're actually dealing with individuals. And regardless of what is happening at that higher level, when it comes to our interactions with our neighbors, with individuals, they must always be done in a manner which is not only dignified, because that is regardless of which level the interaction is at, that must always be there. But on top of that, with an extra level of respect and courtesy for each other.
Thank you so much. And we then continue with you. The same question for you, Deacon Andrew. So we all have an inherent dignity. Where do we go from there in our relationships with others, and especially in terms of relationships among communities?
Well, I think we have to really focus on what is the nature of community, and what is our goal as a human community. And Aristotle talks about the common good. He talks about the common good being human flourishing. And so what does it mean to flourish as a human being? What does it mean to flourish in community with other human beings? And so I think the Christian understanding of this, and certainly from the Catholic tradition, is this idea that in our common life together, there is a radical equality. And this is maybe something that sounds a bit strange to some ears. To hear a Christian, we're seen as being often, especially Catholic, very, very conservative and very, perhaps we're seen as being closed-minded, but to talk about a radical equality, that is at the root, really, of the Catholic understanding of human dignity, as how we live with one another. That we have this radical equality because of that relationship that we have to God, because we have that spark, that divine spark that Rabbi Sher spoke of, that profound beauty of that image and likeness, that I can see myself in my friend Rabbi Sher, I can see myself in Imam Sikander, and vice versa, because we know that we have this common life with one another. And so that's why anytime we see where there is tension, I think what Imam Sikander said about sometimes we identify with groups rather than individuals. We encounter groups rather than the individual human persons that bear that dignity. And so we can get locked in this kind of idea that, oh, you're part of that group, well, therefore I can't have a relationship with you. Well, that's to deny that person's dignity. And in a sense, it's also to reject your own dignity. So we have to also embrace within this concept of radical equality also the beauty of difference, because there is difference. And difference is good. If we believe that God has placed that image and likeness within us, then He also intended for there to be difference. But also complementarity. We find that there's also complementarity within human existence. And so I think as we share a common life with one another, where we're encountering people that look differently from us, who have different gifts from us, who have different abilities from us, and who often believe things that are profoundly different from what we believe, we must never lose sight of that spark, that common and that shared humanity. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that difference isn't important. Difference is important, and we need to acknowledge differences. But also, in that acknowledging of difference, to recognize that there in front of me is my fellow human being. There is a person that has infinite worth. And so therefore I'm called to love them. And it's that simple.
And get to finish off with this second question,
I get
to get along.
Yeah, I get to comment on this part. So those were pretty profound things that my co-panelists have shared. Just trying to think of which avenue to take this. I think that importantly, if we look back in the Jewish tradition, I think we find this idea that God thoughtfully created each and every human being for a specific purpose, for a specific reason. We all have our calling. We all have our very specific purpose in life. I do think we get to this idea how Judaism has never looked outward to even, it takes that idea so seriously that God created each and every individual thoughtfully and specifically, that there's never been a concept of going out and trying to convert someone to Judaism, but rather instead to understand that there are many pathways to God. You're born a Jew. If you desperately want to become a Jew, then maybe that, then there's option, there's opportunity. But the idea is that there really are different pathways to fulfill your purpose, and I think that in that way of thinking, we end up always erring on this side of looking at the dignity of the individual instead of trying to want to change somebody. It's instead embracing them and their specific purpose as one of God's creations. So I think that this concept really does follow through in many different ways when you look in our faith. And I think that going back earlier, or very early on, we're introduced to Abraham, who we sometimes like to consider the first Jew, specific type of Jew. As well, I know that in other traditions, Abraham also gets credit for being the first of other religions as well. And I think looking at the story of Abraham is really quite fascinating. We're only introduced to Abraham when he's already quite old, and he's already gone on this mission to seek God and to create communion with God. And you would have thought that in this very pagan world, the most important story that we could have heard was all about Abraham's exploration. How did he find God? But the Torah doesn't tell us a word about that. Yes, we can look in our traditions, in our oral traditions, to find more about that. But the Torah doesn't tell us that. And I think the very reason why is because there is no one right way. And if we would have been told about how Abraham found God, then that would have been, this is the cookie cutter way to do so. This is the cookie cutter way to find truth. And in Judaism certainly believes that that's absolutely not the case. Jews are called in a certain way, and Christians are called in a certain way, and Muslims are called, and so on and so forth. And I think that creates quite a beautiful harmony that can exist amongst humanity.
And you now get to start the responses to our next question, which is related to something that's very, very relevant. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, one of the reasons that there was a lot of push, a great desire to have this panel this year during this festival is because of what we see happening in the news, what we see happening in various countries, including Canada, but especially south of the border and in other countries. And that is the whole question of racism. So, Rabbi Sher, I want to begin only because that's where we are in the rotation. Today, of course, we all inevitably end up discussing racism. It's different facets, it's different profiles in our society, other societies. First question, which is I guess it's a kind of softball question related to this, is so how do racist attitudes show a rejection of human dignity? I think then a much more difficult question, or a much more complex question, and I don't know how you folks are going to get through this in 5 minutes apiece, but why does racism persist? And then finally, how can all of our communities best combat racism within our own groups?
Yeah. Okay. So I think you're right. So we have the very the softball question, which is how do racist attitudes show rejection of human dignity? That's pretty obvious, right? We've all just been talking about this for 25 minutes now. Every human being is divine, and to be able to show any sort of discrimination because of the color of somebody's skin, because of somebody's race, is obviously to completely ignore and reject the divinity of that human being. So let's go to question number 2. Question number 2, I think, why does racism persist? I think it may be an offshoot of, actually, in my mind, it's an offshoot of that first question. Racism exists because we fail to take our responsibility seriously to recognize the divinity of another human being. Going back to the 90s, the early 90s, in Crown Heights, so I'm from the States, I'm from Chicago originally, and in Crown Heights, New York, which is home, you brought up the Lubavitchers, right, which is home to the Hasidic movement from Chabad, a very famous Hasidic movement. They're actually one of the few communities in the United States that have been racially integrated since the 50s and 60s, right? For everywhere else, you've seen a split. You have your communities that are white, your communities that are black. The Crown Heights has not been, from the very beginning, since the settling of the Chabad movement there, their Rebbe, their rabbi, made it very clear that as white people were moving out of Crown Heights, his Hasidim had to stay, so it remained, and to this very day, is a racially integrated community. And in '92, I believe, there was a, we won't get much into it right now, but there was riots, little race riots, right? And Mayor Dinkins came, the mayor of the New York City, came to visit the Lubavitcher Rebbe at that point in time, and he said that we're going to get both sides together. And the Rebbe immediately corrected him and said, there is no both sides. We're all on one side. And I think that that's what we fail to recognize, because the moment we fail to recognize the divinity of another human being, that's when we don't bother paying attention. And when we don't bother paying attention, we become ignorant. And it's when we become ignorant is when racism is able to fester, because we have no idea about the other community. We are separate. We are two sides. Instead of, as the Rebbe said, we are one side. We are all an expression of the divine. Is that 5 minutes?
No, you've got another 2 minutes.
Another 2 minutes. Okay. We're all the expression of the divine. So how can we best combat it within our communities? Obviously, the answer is to make sure that we start questioning that ignorance. Make sure that we start learning more. Make sure that we start getting together more. We here at our synagogue in February, in honor of Black History Month, we had a Shabbat dinner where we brought together the Jewish community and some of the Black communities of Ottawa. And at that dinner, we actually committed to each other that no longer will our entire engagement be that when there's graffiti sprayed on the synagogue, the Black community will give me a call and send their condolences, or the exact opposite. No longer will that be our relationship, and instead we're going to celebrate together. We're going to share each other's communities and get to know about each other in order to fight that ignorance that leads to racism and ultimately recognize what is our responsibility to the divinity of each and every person.
Wonderful. The same question to
Rabbi Sher said beautifully. There's a verse that we find in the Quran where God says, "O people," so addressing all of us. Indeed, we have created you from single male and female, and made you to tribes and nations, so that you may get to know one another. Therein we find one of the divine wisdoms behind this diversity that we find within humanity, is that so that we are able to learn about one another, recognize one another, because let's face it, there is beauty in diversity. If you have a garden and you only have the same type of flower, it's not as beautiful as, of course, having different types of flowers. Then God tells us, "Inna akramakum 'inda Allahi atqakum," that the most honorable of you in God is the one in the eyes of God, is the one who has the most piety. And from there we find this idea of this intrinsic dignity and honor that belongs to each person, or that each person inherently has. And then on top of that, the acquired honor that comes to a person when they enhance the relationship with God. So that, and of course many other teachings tell us that there is, of course, no room for racism. But when we talk about why it persists. I really feel and believe, and we learn this from the Islamic teachings, that it comes down to a spiritual issue. And that is the spiritual ailment of the heart, which is arrogance. We have a prophetic tradition that tells us that a person, and it sounds harsh, that a person with even an iota of arrogance will not be allowed to enter paradise. And the companions of the Prophet wondered if that had to do with dressing well. So they asked that question. They said, a person likes to dress well and wear nice shoes. Does that mean that they're being arrogant? And the Prophet said that no, arrogance is that which leads to denying the truth and looking down upon people. So that this idea that a person is inherently superior to another because of how they have been created by God versus how someone else has been created by God. So essentially looking down upon people, and that is just one category of looking down upon people. There's many other reasons why people feel entitled to look down upon others, but that is the spiritual root of racism, which is arrogance. So feeling superior to others is something which has been totally condemned. And as long as we, as human beings, continue to consider ourselves as superior to others, unfortunately, this disease will continue to persist. And I fully agree with my friend Rabbi Sher that we absolutely have to continue fighting that through engagement, through learning about others, because part of it is ignorance as well. So fighting that ignorance, but that root of arrogance has to be demolished if this issue is going to be fully done.
Thank you. And Deacon Andrew, same question. Racism, its roots, and how do our communities combat it?
Well, I mean, I agree pretty much entirely with Rabbi Sher and Imam Sikandar. A lot of the great spiritual fathers of the Eastern tradition, the Eastern Christian tradition, have talked about how pride, arrogance, pride, is basically the source of all the other passions, all the other temptations that we face. And if you can conquer pride, don't worry about the other ones. they'll be dealt with. And racism is fundamentally a gross expression of pride, of human pride. And we have to constantly strive to master our pride. But we can't do that without God. We can't do that without returning to this sense of who we are, this dignity that we bear. And we have to strive through that grace that we receive from God to see that dignity again in others. So racism is a manifestation of the brokenness within humanity, the brokenness that derives from the fall. The effects of the fall, that exile from Eden, play out continually in the world. And racism is yet one manifestation of that. Can we end racism? No, we can't end racism. Because of our fallenness as human beings, there will be racists. And there will be racist Catholics. And there are racist Catholics. And they're bad Catholics because of that. In fact, all of us are bad Catholics for various reasons. but to be a racist is completely inconsistent with Catholic teaching and with Christian teaching, because it is a denial of that dignity of the person. And so that has to be something that we have to consistently combat through engagement, through encounter, through being in the presence of others who are different from us, so that we might love them more fully. Because the surest way to combat pride, the surest way to combat manifestations of pride, such as racism, is to grow in genuine human love. And as Christians, we believe that it is, again, Christ who points the way for that. He's the one that heals the divisions that exist. We can speak a lot about diversity, And I talked about how diversity is very important because there is diversity in the human family. But we cannot talk about diversity unless we also speak about unity. And this is the points made by both Rabbi Sher and Imam Sikandar, that our humanity is a unified humanity. Regardless of our race, of our ethnic background, of our religious belief, whatever it might be, we are bound together, again, by that spark, by that dignity that we bear. And so to combat racism, to fight against racism, is to be restored to that understanding of who we are. And we have to do that as people of faith and as faith leaders by continually reminding people of that message of human dignity. It's only through that we can truly combat racism. And please God, we're able to draw people to that greater awareness of who they are.
Since this next question deals with prejudice and religious prejudice and racism in a more generic way, it's appropriate that we ask the Canada's first ambassador of religious freedom, who is very, very committed to defending the cause of religious freedom, to deal with this question. And that question is the following. Racism is one form of prejudice, but there's legion, there's a multitude of other forms. Specifically, there's the perennial problem, the wound, scourge of anti-Semitism, something that has become much more evident in the last several decades. Anti-Muslim attitudes here in Western countries, and oddly enough, increasingly anti-Christian attitudes, which is something that the Office of Religious Freedom was very committed to drawing attention to as a new aspect of prejudice in certain countries. The question is, what do these prejudices say about the need to work towards living a common life amidst what are often very deep differences? Now, I think you immediately recognize it's a kind of variation of what we've been talking about, but it brings in the fact that at times it's precisely we within our religious communities can be prejudiced, and we are different. We remain different. We're not going. One of the beauties of this panel, and we really hats off to, or keep us off to this wonderful synagogue for being willing to host a discussion where we talk about differences. So, how do we work towards living a common life amidst what are often very deep differences?
I think the first thing is, as I said earlier on, is to acknowledge that those differences exist. The worst thing we can do when we're engaging with one another, especially with different religious beliefs, is to say, well, we all believe the same thing. We all, at the most fundamental level, believe the same thing. That's not being honest. And it's insulting to people. Because we do believe, there are certain things we believe that are common on us. We've just been having this wonderful conversation about human dignity. There's a lot of commonality here. But there are also fundamental differences. And so we have to acknowledge those differences. Obviously, Rabbi Sher and Imam Sikandar are going to have very different understandings of who Jesus Christ is from me. And that's fine. I disagree with them. They disagree with me. But again, we share this common humanity. And we need to be able to have the conversations about those disagreements in that unity of our humanity. Because God, reveals himself to us. And because he recognizes that we are bound together in this image and likeness of his that we bear, we also have to have community. And community is a messy business sometimes. But when we talk about prejudices like anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim prejudice, anti-Christian prejudice, we have to recognize that those exist not only between members of our various communities towards the other, where we denigrate the other because they don't believe what we believe, but also from more secular society looking at us and saying, you can't be who you are in the public square. We don't want you to be fully a Jew in the public square, or fully a Muslim, or fully a Christian. You need to privatize what you believe. Keep quiet in the public square. Just do what you do in the shul, in the mosque, in the church. And once you're outside, we don't want to hear from you. Well, that's not living a common life. And that is not actually recognizing the dignity that people bear. I've told this story once before. I think Rabbi Sher heard me mention this. This wonderful story about Saint Josemaria Escriva, Spanish saint in the 20th century. He was giving a talk at a university in Spain. And a young woman who was Jewish asked him a question and asked him how can he, as a Roman Catholic priest, sort of speak to the problem of anti-Semitism, the problem that Jews have faced, the prejudice that Jews have faced. And Saint Josemaria responded in a very interesting way. He said, "The love of my life is a Jew," referring to Jesus Christ. And isn't that wonderful if we can have that depth of humility and that depth of love for others, recognizing that we believe different things, but recognizing that without you, I cannot be me. Without the relationship that I have with you, I cannot possibly live a full and rich human life. And I think this is something that I know a lot of the rabbis have said, like Rabbi Akiva, and he's talked about this over yesterday. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel talked about these questions about, I, thou, Martin Buber, this understanding of how we interact with one another. And so when we confront prejudice, whether it's anti-Semitism or anti-Muslim sentiment, as people of faith, we must combat that strenuously. And we must be the champions for that community that is facing prejudice. It's the Christian's first duty to be the champion for the Muslim and to be the champion for the Jew in that public space, and vice versa.
Thank you. Turning to a Muslim, the whole question of prejudice and how do we work towards living a common life due to the fact that differences remain.
Yeah, we can agree with that more. Of course, it is essential to who we are that we recognize our commonalities, but of course our differences as well. And also recognize that there are elements or people within our faith communities who will have and continue to cause trouble, spread hatred against our respective faiths and adherents of our faiths. And that is a reality that we have to deal with. But at the same time, as correctly pointed out, we are facing this other challenge as well that is common to all of us. So I think at the end of the day, when it comes to the way we see others, people who practice differently, who believe in different things, one thing that strikes me that really sort of puts it all together is what we learn in our faith is that there is no compulsion in religion. And if we are able to understand and believe in that fully, then we recognize that each individual is entitled by God to make their own choice when it comes to their beliefs, whether we agree with it or not. And therefore, that leads us to this fundamental respect for religious freedoms and religious rights. And the other thing also that grounds us is that we should want for others and wish for others what we want for ourselves. This teaching in Islam is seen as something that exists between adherents of the faith, so my Muslim brother or sister in faith, but also brother and sister in humanity as well. And therefore, if I want to be safe from persecution, therefore I must also be willing then to stand for others, and that is something I feel very strongly about in today's times, that whenever, and this is something I personally try to do, and I encourage members of my own community and all faith leaders to do, that whenever we have the opportunity to speak and to advocate for our own rights, that we also use that platform and that opportunity to advocate for the rights of our fellow brothers and sisters in humanity as well, with their rights and to practice freely and to in safety, that we stand up for each other. And that is something that we must absolutely do, because if we do not do that, then we all suffer. When a synagogue is attacked, that is an attack on me and my religious rights and freedoms as well. When a Christian is persecuted, that is also an attack on me and my fellow Muslims as well, because we are all people of faith. So attacks against a faith are not just an attack against that faith, they're attacks against all faiths, and we must always be united in fighting bigotry and discrimination.
Thank you. And to conclude with that question, Rabbi?
Yeah, sure. So just riffing off of what the Imam said about how, let's say, an attack on one community is an attack on all of us. I remember one time sitting on a panel. I actually think Imam Sikandar is there as well, and it was obvious that we had a nice friendship, but also we enjoyed a good laugh together. And someone was pretty surprised to see it. Someone that was listening to the panel, and they said, "How does this work? Right? You guys." Each one of you holds your faith so dearly. It's probably the most important part of your identity. And at the very essence, you disagree bitterly with each other. And yet here you are, seemingly to actually be not just sitting on a panel together, but actually being pretty good friends. And what I pointed out, and I think this is true of the faiths being represented here today, is differences. There's no reason that should ever make a difference. In the Jewish tradition, we have the concept of learning Torah together with a study partner. And learning Torah together with a study partner isn't sitting in a library being very quiet. Learning Torah together with a study partner, the way the Talmud describes it, is a milchamta shel Torah, which means a battle of Torah. And you would be yelling and screaming for hours and hours on one nuanced point, both of you disagreeing vehemently with each other. And in that same line, the Talmud tells us the words of O chavruta o metuta, that better would be death if not without a study partner. In other words, there's absolutely no reason when you think logically, when you take the emotion out of it and are able to just think as a cool, calm, collected human being, why disagreement about anything should at all take away from the love that two people enjoy between each other, the friendship that two people enjoy between each other. And I think that was exactly the point that I shared. That's true within the Jewish community, it's true within the human community, the community of humanity. And as I see the faith of another so enrich the other person's life, it may not be my faith, but why should that make any difference when we're talking about the relationship that exists between each one of us? Am I at 5 minutes?
You got another minute.
Another minute. Okay, so the relationship that exists between each one of us, and then not to mention, of course, that when it comes to specifically to prejudice, we would be completely denigrating our responsibility to God if we see God's expression in humanity being denigrated and us ignoring it, us not calling out, us not doing everything to fight that. Because for us not to fight that is, in truth, not to fight and not to be there in solidarity with God and God's self.
We're going to shift gears in one sense, but what makes it rather similar to the previous questions is very much on our minds, a very relevant issue, and that's the whole question of the pandemic that we find ourselves in, that reality that makes it just that makes communication so strange. The inability to see each other's smiles, the mask, the inability to touch each other, shake hands, etc. For many people in our society, the pandemic has raised various fears around the whole question of suffering, and I'm glad you're on because you're going to get the first shot at this question. I forgot to mention that as I introduced the question. So we see an increasing sense of fear surrounding the issue of suffering, encountering our limits, our weakness, an increasing fear of death. The question for all of us, starting with Imam Sikander, is what do our various traditions, in this case, what does your tradition in particular say about how humans are to address these fears and anxieties, and how is it possible sometimes to lose our sense of dignity when we suffer?
Of course, a very relevant question. And the first thing I would say is that as individuals, God has created us different. So each individual is going to respond to a set of circumstances and situation differently. And this is a message I was especially trying to drive home at the beginning of the pandemic, because members of the family, there's great diversity within the family with, one child, responding differently to, school being closed, not being able to go out, and other, members of the family responding in different ways. So each one of us is possibly going to have a different reaction, and that is okay. We are naturally, as human beings, we have weaknesses, and when we have circumstances where we are facing a great deal of uncertainty, it is natural for us to feel those vulnerabilities and weaknesses a lot more so. The way we look at it from the Islamic perspective is that there are things that God has given us abilities for, that we are able, that God has given us the ability to make decisions for, but those are very limited matters. In the big picture, a lot of things, most things, have been decided for us, and amongst that, within that, are things like illness, things like tragedies, and life and death. These are things that we do not control. God controls them. And they have been predetermined for us, except we don't know what God has decided. So as we go through the journey of life, our job is essentially to try our reasonable best to make the right decisions, and recognize that there are many things that are unexpected in life, and unfortunately, we happen to be living through one of them right now. Actually, let me rephrase that. We're living through uncertainties all the time, except we realize it more at this point, because it is much more visible to us, and we feel it, and we're experiencing it. So our job, my favorite line that I always throw out in my sermons is, try your best and leave for God the rest. So at every single moment, our job is to try to make the most reasonable and best decision. Do we know what the future holds for us? No, we don't know. Only God knows. But we try our best to make the best decision, and then we place our trust in God. And there is this fine balance between trying our best, but also then letting go, and realizing that the results are not in our hands. So, yes, it's a challenging time, but faith plays a very, very important role in giving us comfort, recognizing that we are trying our best, and that is what we are accountable for, that is our job, and the rest is up to God. And whatever God has decided then, I am okay with that. I'm willing to accept whatever God has decided, because God is most wise and most knowledgeable, and I firmly believe that whatever God has decided for me will, in the long run, will be better for me. There's a verse in the Quran where we learn that there may be things that we dislike that are good for us. There may be things that we love, but they're actually bad for us. God knows, and we do not know. So this may be, of course, there is great pain and suffering, but there may be a silver lining, or it may be a blessing in disguise, a blessing that we're not able to see at this point. But we always try to live with optimism, and even when we feel down, we always try to find the positivity and hold on to hope that there is something better that God has planned for us, that we just not are able to see or experience or witness at this moment.
Thank you. And the rotation brings us back to Father Andrew. And do you need a...
But I want to pick up on this question of control and just speak a little bit of that, and then also on dignity within suffering. So Imam Sikandar is exactly right. We are not in control. Now this comes as a radically crazy idea for a lot of people in our North American society today. Because many of us think that we are sovereign, that I am in charge, and freedom, our human free will, means to do whatever I want. I'm free to do whatever I want. I'm a self-actualizing, sovereign individual. Well, you're not. First of all, in the Christian understanding, especially the Catholic understanding, human freedom has to be oriented towards something, and it's the freedom to do the good, is to pursue the good, and therefore to fully understand again what it means to be human. But we cannot control everything. And we all know that. We know that in our deepest hearts. Anxiety results when we think we can. And the human mortality rate is 100%. We're all going to die, and we're all going to suffer. Some of us might be spared great suffering. Others of us are going to suffer greatly. But suffering has meaning. It is not empty. We do not lose our dignity in suffering. Can our external our external propriety be affected? Of course it can, by disease. We can find all sorts of things that can go wrong with our body. We might be bedridden. We might lose the ability to use our limbs, to speak, to see. We might even lose the ability to breathe. But we do not lose that image and likeness, which is at the core of our dignity. And in suffering, there is meaning. Suffering is hard. No one wants to experience suffering. Thomas Cardinal Collins, the Archbishop of Toronto, famously said in a speech he gave at his annual dinner some years ago, he said, "The one who drools has no less dignity than the one who does not." That when someone is suffering and we see the other person suffering, it brings forth from us compassion. It brings forth from us patience, love, a desire to journey with that person in their suffering. And so therefore, to artificially end suffering, for example, through euthanasia, is a grave evil. Because of its, there's all sorts of issues around it, we all know these issues, I won't get into detail here in 5 minutes, but in one respect, it takes away that ability to suffer with the other person. Compassion, to suffer with the other person. And therefore to realize again that image and likeness within yourself and to see it in the other. And so I think at this time when we are fearful, many of us are anxious about what is happening, is recognize that we're not in control, but that we are called to be with others, even when we've got our masks on, even when we're distanced from one another. We can still reach out in a somewhat artificial way, granted. But that's essential, again, for us to realize fully our humanity.
The same question?
Yeah. Sorry, I was just looking for some notes I wrote about something else about this question. I'll try to find them before the next question because I think the 2 questions are going to be a bit similar. But anyways, so on this point, it's interesting. At the very beginning of this of the pandemic, so mid-March, there were questions that kept coming up, and both of the questions there's like 2 major questions. Major question number 1 that the community really wanted to hear being addressed was, why do bad things happen to good people? And that was question number 1. And then, interestingly, the second question that was brought up and the community really wanted to hear about was medical assistance in dying. Although I think probably the connection was this idea of how there was gonna, if the hospitals were overloaded, then there would have to be choices as who was going to live and who was going to die. And this question came up. I think that was one reason this question came up. Well, as there was more suffering in the world, people people start to think more about suffering, and then that type of question came up. So I think that those really were the two big questions that arose at the very beginning of this pandemic, and that we had special classes of many people attending on Zoom, obviously, where we addressed these two questions in our faith. And to answer the specific question, can we lose our dignity when we suffer? Everything we've been saying up until this point is putting a focus on not our physical bodies, because that's not the essence of who we are. The essence of who we are is our soul, our spirit, whatever it is that you want to refer to it as, that divine spark. And of course, that's never going to be impacted. That's never going to be affected by anything physical. It transcends all of that. And a message that I sometimes will share is that when it comes to, again, use whatever word you want for matters of the spirit. Use the word God. Use the word the spiritual. Use whatever. That's really irrelevant. But if that is something that at all resonates with you, then make sure it becomes part of your vocabulary. And not just part of your vocabulary, but part of your way of internal thinking. And not just your own internal thinking, but make sure you're speaking about it at home and that your family hears these words. Because as you begin to create a stronger connection with matters of the spirit, with something transcendental, with God, all of this sudden, the question of suffering becomes a very different question. The question of death and the fear of death becomes a very different question. I'll never forget sitting in the Roger Nielsen House. Right, it's one of the most difficult places that a clergy person can go here in Ottawa. It's a hospice for children, and there was one specific family that had this intense belief in the spiritual, this intense connection with the godly, and the way they interacted with the death of their child was so different than I had ever seen before, and it cemented in because yes, the physical body of their child was no longer, but certainly who their child was, that would live on forever, because the essence of a person is infinite. And as I saw them interact with that traumatic, the most painful experience that anybody could ever face, it really ingrained in me the importance of making sure that these are matters that I myself become closer to, and in turn counsel and guide and try to teach anybody that will listen to me to become closer to as well, because it completely turns every question surrounding this, every question revolving on this, on its head.
Thank you. And we now move to our last question, which will be responded to by all of you. So, what concrete actions, and if I'm not mistaken, I think we start with Sikander again. What concrete actions do you believe that our faith communities can embark on to offer hope and to respond to the various challenges that we've been talking about for the last, whatever it is, an hour and a half or so? In short, what is your community's, my community's responsibility to the broader community? And feel free to be as specific as you want, to throw in as many anecdotes as you want, concrete examples. Sometimes, we don't like to draw attention to something that someone has done within our faith community because it seems like we're, tuning our horn. But if there's something that has been tried, has been done, has been successful, or has even been tried and maybe not have been as successful as people would hope, please feel free to share that with us.
As we go forward, we will have opportunities that we will have to find to connect with one another and to show the positive role that faith undoubtedly plays in the public sphere, in broader society. One of those, since you're asking for specifics, sometimes it's the little things. It's the little steps, because we often think about the world and humanity, and it's daunting, right? Because how am I going to change what everyone is thinking? even when it comes to my own faith community. I'm just this little guy in Canada. What am I going to do? So it's crucial that we start somewhere, and that somewhere is local, with our neighbors, the people that we know. And I firmly believe that little things can sometimes become the greatest of things. And indeed, something great starts off with something small. So specifically, what we have started doing locally is that whenever our holidays come around, so we have 2 major holidays in the year, we've started a tradition of having a Caravan of Joy. And what we do is it started off with churches, and this actually was sparked by the mosque shooting in Quebec City, and the response that we received from local faith communities, particularly churches in our area. There were a number of faith groups that reached out that offer support, and that was really touching. And I'm sure we can all relate. We get messages when a tragedy occurs, and for those who are sharing those messages, it may not seem like a lot, but in reality, it has a profound impact on us as individuals and on our congregations, our communities. So we really wanted to respond with something positive as well. So that year, Ramadan ended on a Sunday. So the celebration was on a Sunday. So the idea was, why don't we do a little surprise? So we had trays of baklava, gift trays, printed some thank you letters, put them in different frames, pretty simple. And we published a list of local churches that we would be visiting without telling anyone. So this was a surprise even for our own community. So at the prayer in the morning, the house said, okay, whoever wants to come along is welcome to come along. We're going to have a Caravan of Joy, just cars driving up to each of these churches. These are the addresses. Here's how you get there. Come along. It was the most beautiful experience, I think, the most beautiful Eid that we celebrated, because we walked up to all these churches, and it was funny, right? Because it's like, you could notice, the element of surprise, what's going on. A group of Muslims, people who look like Muslims, they're all dressed up on a Sunday morning. They're coming to a church. What's happening? We got delayed, so we actually arrived at a couple of churches after their services had started. And I didn't want to crash the service, but it was so spontaneous, being welcomed in. I remember one of the United churches, the minister was like, no, just wait, he's sitting. They had just started, so he's standing down in front, he sees me outside, he's just telling me, pleading with me, just to hold on a minute, because I was going to leave. I didn't want to disturb him. A beautiful experience. There happened to be a gentleman who was visiting from the United Kingdom who actually has a segment on BBC Radio that airs across Great Britain. And he happened to witness what happened. And he went back, and lo and behold, it was part of the segment next week. So little things, right? Little things that give people hope, and that help bring people together. We've moved on now from churches. We've done first responders. We did hydro workers, city workers, libraries. So different locations that we try to come up with a new one each time. But essentially, my point is little things that we can do to bring people together, that give people hope, and show that we can live together with mutual love and respect, and that religions are not the source of conflict.
And would one of you prefer to guide? And this is the last question, and this will be the last time that we respond to a question like that. Although what I want to prepare you for is because you've been so disciplined. Most of the time you haven't taken your 5 minutes. We've got about 10 minutes at the end where I invite you, after you responded to this last question, to just share anything that you feel that really should be mentioned, something that you didn't get a chance to say earlier, something that you feel will be an appropriate supplement to this discussion. But in any case, so who feels like, are you okay?
Totally fine, yeah.
Okay, we'll go for it.
Absolutely. Right. Okay, so as I told Mary, my kid's bus is going to pull up in front of the synagogue at 4:45. So this is actually perfect. Thank you for allowing me to go first. And then when they do arrive, I'm happy to bring my kids in and they can just sit down. This is a little, I don't even know where this poem came from, but I think it really does incorporate a lot of what the Jewish tradition talks about when we speak about uncertainty and suffering and the difficulties and challenges in life. It's very simple. I asked for strength, and God gave me difficulties to make me strong. I asked for wisdom, and God gave me problems to solve. I asked for prosperity, and God gave me brawn and brain to work. I asked for courage, and God gave me dangers to overcome. I asked for love, and God gave me troubled people to help. My prayers were answered. And I think that very much is a way of thinking, is a perspective that runs as a common theme through many of our different faiths, and that is there is the question of why do bad things happen to good people? Why do people receive these terrible challenges or these seemingly terrible challenges? But I think there's also the question of what can we learn and what can we do and what are we supposed to be understanding that we otherwise wouldn't have understood, that we now can bring to the fore, that would have sat dormant if not for these challenges. So I think that's perspective number one, in which we can really and have been, and the example that the Imam gave is beautiful, where we can learn from any sort of circumstance and really take this step forward in making this world a better place because of it. And I think it's also about understanding our responsibility and just how powerful we can be. You sometimes think of that line, one small step for man, one giant step for mankind. And sometimes I think about, changing it a little bit, and it's one small step for man is one giant step for God. Like, we cannot ever underestimate the incredible impact that any one of us can have. And I'll just finish off with a short Hasidic story, a story from the Hasidic tradition. And that one goes as follows. There's Elijah the prophet. Elijah the prophet is the herald of the Messiah in the Jewish tradition. Righteous, somebody that the Hebrew Bible tells us, right, when instead of dying a normal human death, went up, and it just basically went up to the heavens and became sort of angelic. And it's great. It's the most righteous of the righteous that are able to experience Elijah the prophet in their lives, to meet Elijah the prophet. And there was one chassid, one Hasidic man who went and who just desperately wanted to meet Elijah the prophet. And he went to his Rebbe, he went to his spiritual master and said, "What can I do to meet Elijah the prophet?" And the spiritual master said, "Forget about it, you're not going to be able to meet Elijah the prophet." And he would go back every year. And finally, I guess he wore his spiritual master down, and the rabbi said to him, "Okay, I'll tell you exactly what you need to do, but you need to follow my instructions to the T. You need to take tons and tons of food before Rosh Hashanah, before the Jewish New Year, and go out to this home about 100 miles away. It's in a forest, and knock on their door." And he had no idea why he was to do this, but that's exactly what he did. And he found this hut, this ramshackle hut, and knocks on the door, and it's kids that are disheveled, and parents that seemingly they have nothing to their name. And he said, "I'm here for Rosh Hashanah. I'm here for the Jewish New Year." And they said, "We're so sorry. We'd love to take you in, but we have nothing ourselves." And he says, "Oh, not to worry. I brought all this delicious food." And they had never seen this much food and this much drink in their life. The same thing happens with Yom Kippur, right? 10 days later, the Jewish Day of Atonement, there's this big break fast. Right afterwards, you break your fast afterwards, and it's a celebration as you finish the Day of Atonement. And his Rebbe said, "You got to go back there," and he goes back there. And again, I have nowhere to be for Yom Kippur. "Oh, you can come in, but we don't have anything to offer you for the break fast." He said, "I have plenty of food and plenty of drink." They are so excited; they've never seen this much food and drink. And then the next holiday right after that is Sukkot. And this time the Rebbe told him, "You have to go back for Sukkot this time." And each time he comes back and he says, "I haven't seen Elijah the prophet. Why do you keep telling me to do these things?" And the last time he gets to their house, and instead of knocking on the door, he listens from the window and he hears the husband and wife speaking. and the husband says, what are we going to do for Sukkot? We have absolutely nothing to feed our children. And the wife answers and says, just like Elijah the prophet responded to us on Rosh Hashanah, and he responded to us again on Yom Kippur, he will certainly respond to us again tonight. And sure enough, he went back, and now he understood. His Rebbe was teaching him an incredibly important idea, and that is that it's not about meeting Elijah the prophet, it's about becoming Elijah the prophet, which is in the bandwidth of every single human being, because as each one of us are godly, each one of us has that divine spark, each one of us can make that powerful difference in the world far beyond what we ever could have imagined.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. So Rabbi, we're going to let you go for a couple of minutes, 10, 15 minutes, or however long you need, but you're going to come back to then be able to share with us anything else that you want to share with us, and if there's anything that you feel was left unspoken.
Yeah,
Okay?
and I felt that it was important to talk about Hasidic stories as we're celebrating the Ukrainian festival.
Oh,
right?
yeah, listen,
So it would be
I'll
remiss.
you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
And then, now that you mentioned his name, he was the rabbi in that story.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Wonderful.
very important.
So we're going to be waiting for you.
For sure.
Maybe not as much as for Elijah the prophet, but and not only that, but we have a pretty good assurance that you will be back, particularly at a specific time.
Yeah.
in 5 minutes. So please do come back. And that last question about concrete human activities, etc., that can be undertaken to Deacon Andrew, and then we will just have concluding remarks starting with the Imam, then Andrew, and then the Rabbi.
Great, thanks, Father Peter. So the word deacon in English, for the people that are watching this, and for those here present, it comes from the Greek word diakonos, which comes from the Greek word diakonia. Diakonia means basically to be called into service. And so a deacon in the Christian tradition is someone who is called into service. And so at Cardis, the think tank that I work with here in Ottawa, we just recently launched a project called the Diakonia Project. And what we're doing with this project is we're going across the country to different faith traditions. And we're asking people, what do you do to live out your faith in the public square? What does your faith impel you to do? And so we're profiling 8 different faith-based initiatives that are being led in different parts of the country. So among those, we have, for example, with the Shia Ismaili Jamaat, we're working with them to profile their Ismaili Civic Initiative, which is a broad national initiative, where there are Shia Ismaili Muslims across the country that are doing all sorts of amazing things in their communities, including this group of older women who are making face masks and then distributing them across the country. We have a Jewish organization in Toronto, Ve'ahavta, which is a ministry to the homeless in the GTA. We have here in Ottawa Matthew House, which is an evangelical Protestant initiative, broadly multi-denominational, that helps to settle refugees. With the Union Gospel Mission in Vancouver, we have in Winnipeg a charity, a faith-based initiative I know that's dear to Father Peter as well as it is to me, and that's an initiative called the Welcome Home, which is led by Ukrainian Greek Catholics under the leadership of the Redemptorist Order of priests and religious. And the Welcome Home ministers to some of the poorest in the north end of Winnipeg, in particular urban Indigenous Canadians who are present there, with a whole range of different programs. And to see the Welcome Home, and see a photograph of it, it's this kind of big old ramshackle north end house. And when I reached out to Father Larry Condra, who currently directs the Welcome Home, and I said, Father, we'd like to learn a little bit more about what you do. We want you to write about what the Welcome Home does, and then we want to do a profile on this. And he said to me something that most of the other people that I spoke to had said for all the other different initiatives. He said, well, we just do it. We don't look for any sort of advertising of what we do. We're not looking for a lot of attention. We just do this. No one tells us to do it. And I said, Father, that's exactly why we need to hear about it. That's why Canadians need to hear about it. Not only our different faith communities need to hear about what their own people are doing out in the world, but our political leaders need to hear about it. You know, our business leaders, media, and so forth need to hear that people of faith are not just stuck in their shuls and their mosques and their churches, their gurdwaras, their kingdom halls. They're outside, living out their faith, doing all these different things. And I said, that's why we need you to tell your story. And so what I would say in terms of concrete action that we all need to do, especially in our faith communities, is live your faith. Be authentic. Don't privatize your faith. Don't leave it in a little box on a table by your door when you leave the house to be picked up when you come back. Don't just leave your faith in the masjid or in the shul or in the church. You have to go out into the world. And we talk often in the Christian context about the liturgy after the liturgy. What is the public act I'm going to do when I leave public worship? It's to go out and be there not just for myself, not just for my own community, but for the whole world. Or as great Orthodox theologian Father Alexander Schmidt would say, for the life of the world. That this is what we do. So we can only do that if we live our faith fully. And if we take our role in the public square seriously, and not to privatize our faith, not to marginalize our faith, and not to let other people do that to us, but really to be present, to be the best Catholic, the best Muslim, the best Jew we can be in the public square, not just for ourselves, but for everyone that is present there who needs us to be that authentic Christian, that authentic Jew, that authentic Muslim.
Thank you so much. That's the last response to the last of the 6 questions. And as I just said a couple of minutes ago, we've got several minutes to be able just to wrap things up in any way that you feel is appropriate. So, everything you've said for the last hour and 20, 30 minutes has been immensely inspiring. And so I have every confidence that whatever you decide to add at this point will be equally insightful and enriching. So, if we could maybe have 5 minutes from you, and then I think we'll have to do another 5 minutes from you, and then while we wait for
for hearing all the insightful comments and imagining, if I was a member of the audience, I think sometimes one of the things that might hold us back and moving in the direction and in the way that we are proposing that we should as faith communities. One of the things that can hold us back, and I've experienced this, after giving talks in public places and giving questions, is the past. So when we look at our histories, individually as faith groups and also our interfaith relations, there's a lot of things that I think we can each find in our respective histories and in our religious teachings that can perhaps act as a barrier or in some ways hold us back from moving forward down this path. And I think one of the things that I've personally found to be very helpful is to ask myself, and I think each one of us should ask ourselves this question, that the past is the past, and that is something that we cannot deny. It is a part of our history and of who we are. But moving forward, what kind of future do we want? Do we want a future that looks like the past, so that we live in the same way, with the same type of relation with our fellow faith groups and fellow human beings? Or do we want a better future? Do we want to replicate what has already happened and continue to live by those the lessons or by the experiences that we've gone through? Or is there something better? And I like to believe, when I answer that question for myself, is that we can do better. As faith communities and as faith leaders, despite our differences and our histories and even current day realities, we must aspire to a better future. And we must move towards that. And we have a role to play in moving forward towards a future that does not look like the past. And the reason why I keep highlighting this is because I feel it's very easy to fall into that. When we read history, when we come across movies or TV shows that are, reenacting historical events, it's very easy to be held back and to not want to trust the other. But there is hope, and we can move forward. But we each have a role to play in doing that, and that is the constant, conflict I find, even within communities, within faith communities, is that, do we go back to how things have been, or do we trust that we can do better in the future? And I'd like to believe.
Some concluding thoughts from you, and then to wrap it all in, Rabbi.
Well, I'm going to conclude on what might seem a strange way to conclude, and that is to talk about idolatry. Another thing that unites the three of us here is that all of our faiths reject the worship of idols, and reject idolatry. And I think that is what is at the core of many of the challenges we face in our present society can come down to idolatry. And the idols that have been fashioned that we as a society worship implicitly or explicitly. Right now, we see south of the border, and increasingly here in Canada as well, the idols of ideology that we have fashioned. Ideologies that divide people, that create us and them. Us and them, political ideologies, us and them, sexual ideologies, us and them, racial ideologies. Enough. This is idolatry, because you're yielding ourselves to these ideologies and dividing ourselves from one another. And this has to stop. We also are creating idols out of money continually. That's an old one. We're creating idols out of ourselves as well. Getting back to the point that I made earlier about how I am supreme, I am sovereign, and my interests come before yours. And all of our faith communities here reject that out of hand. That we cannot have that type of idolatry in place within our society. So as people of faith, maybe there are people that are watching this discussion today thinking, oh, I know who you guys are. I know what you're all about. And especially that Catholic guy there. I know what he's all about. I know what he believes in. He's homophobic, he's anti-women, he's this, that, and the other thing. Well, you're going to disagree with what I believe. And all of us here hold our beliefs sincerely. And the secular world might not like what we believe. We are called, I would say, as people of faith, to a great responsibility given the idolatries that exist in our world right now. Because we have taken a stand throughout our histories as rejecting idolatry, as rejecting idols. Now we have to do the same thing again. And so I think as Christians, Muslims, and Jews, we must come together in a much more concerted fashion, a much more public fashion, with trusting in God and not being fearful of what we face out there in the world, these idols, because we have experience with idols. And I think that the three of us as faith leaders here today should commit to that, to be much more clear in how we articulate the beauty of the human person, the beauty of worship of God, the truth in that, the goodness in that. That religion is a good. It is not something that is evil. It is not something that denigrates people. Do religious people do bad things? Absolutely. Because people do bad things. So I think we need to rededicate ourselves to come together as people of faith, again, to take our place in the public square and to raise the bar and really to point back again to this source of our human community, and that is the inherent dignity that we all bear.
The deacon here was just expounding on an element of the Torah. Regards to the question of idolatry. So I think that it's very appropriate that we conclude with the religious tradition that kind of got all of us started here. It's the book of Exodus, which is very, very specific about the whole problem of idolatry, the sin of idolatry. So gratitude to our elder brothers, as Pope John Paul II said, we turn to you for some concluding reflections, Rabbi.
All right. I think it's only appropriate that I share one more Hasidic story. And also the story will look back to Genesis and as well an interfaith dialogue. So there was the founder, again, you brought up the Lubavitcher Hasidic movement, so we'll go right back to that one more time, and we'll go to the first rabbi the founder of the Lubavitch movement, Rabbi Zalman of Liadi. He's known as the Alter Rabbi. Alter in Yiddish means old, so he's the old rabbi, because he was the first of this movement. And his political opponents informed on him to the government. Basically, he was being way too Jewish, and he was informed on. And he was put into jail for 57 days in St. Petersburg. And in jail, actually, the known painting that we have of him, picture that we have of him, was actually painted by somebody while he was in prison. And the way the story goes is that one of the prison guards was a very faithful, committed Christian person. And he saw that this rabbi, like this guy was something else. He saw in his demeanor that this man was something else. And he said, so one day he had the opportunity to speak to this rabbi, and he decided he was going to ask him a question that had plagued him about the Old Testament, about the Hebrew Bible, about a verse in Genesis that had plagued him, and he never got the right answer to. So he turned to the rabbi, who was his prisoner, and he said, after Adam and Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden, God comes out and says, Ayeka, which means, where are you? Now, God knows everything. So why in the world would God ask, where are you? And the rabbi responded, and he said, do you, Mr. Warden, do you believe that every single word and every single verse in the Bible does not just speak to that moment in time, but rather to every single human being for the entire future of human history? And the warden said, of course I do. And he said, well, perhaps God was not asking that question necessarily just to Adam and Eve, but rather to each and every single one of us, including us standing in this prison here in St. Petersburg. Where are you? And I think that that's a question that is so important for us as individuals, for us as communities, for us as faith communities, to constantly be asking ourselves, where are you? It's important that we reflect, what did our past look like, and what are we going to do to make sure that our future looks different? It's lighter, more full of light, more full of beauty, and more full of the perfection that we can bring to the world as the creation, as divine creations. And I think that's on a panel that's dedicated to human dignity, to fighting against racism and other sorts of prejudices. I think that's the question we all need to be asking ourselves. The same question God asked Adam and Eve is, where Ayeka, where are you? So thanks so much for putting this together. Thanks so much for having me. And I thought that would be an appropriate thought to finish off with.
Thank you. Absolutely. As always, Rabbi, anything you say is always appropriate. Before we thank our panelists, allow me, on behalf of all of our viewing audience, to thank the Capital Ukrainian Festival for organizing this very timely and thought-provoking interfaith dialogue. I have to say that I've got a PhD in theology, but and it's not to suggest just because you have a PhD in theology you actually know something, but this has been very, very enriching for me. And so I can imagine that our viewers throughout the world are going to find this extremely enriching. And so at the start, I thanked Mary, who was very much directly involved in organizing this. But I also want to draw attention, she's here with us, Jane Colby, who is the chair of the organizing committee of the Capital Ukrainian Festival. So thanks to you also, Jane. A special thanks to Congregation Machzikei Hadas for hosting this event. And I want to draw attention to something that makes the Ukrainian Jewish connection very, very specific and very particular. I'm a Ukrainian Catholic priest. I'm supposed to be wearing a hat. I have one, but I left it in Toronto, unfortunately. I'm supposed to be wearing a hat that's much more similar to what Deacon Andrew is wearing. I couldn't find it this morning, actually this afternoon, 20 minutes before I was leaving the house, and I'm looking around, and the only appropriate head covering that I could find was a kippah, which I got in the West Ukrainian town of Drohobych last year when I visited the newly renovated synagogue in Drohobych. Drohobych was a very important shtetl, a very important Jewish center in what is today present-day Western Ukraine. And I must say that anyone knowing what the synagogue in Drohobych looked like just 10 years ago and seeing what it looks like today would be moved to tears. It gives hope for anyone who knows about the difficulties that religious minorities and groups that are discriminated against have experienced in the past. This community, Drohobych, finds itself in a country where for a short while the government had the only government outside of Israel where both the president and the prime minister were Jewish. I don't know whether people were aware of that, but when President Zelensky was elected overwhelmingly by the population of Ukraine as the president of Ukraine, at that time, the prime minister, Mr. Groisman, who's also Jewish, was the prime minister, and so, as some people noted, this was the only country in the world outside of Israel where both the presidency and the prime ministerial portfolio was being carried by Jews. So anyone who knows that history, the history of Eastern Europe, knows about the Holocaust by bullets, which has been documented so well by a Catholic priest, Father Patrick de Blois, has to say, wow, there is hope, and not only does modern-day Ukraine provide some amazing examples for us in that respect, but fortunately this Capital Ukraine Festival has also been working in the same vein. Finally, and most importantly, I do want to thank the people without whom we would not have had this very, very enriching panel. And so I thank each of our esteemed panelists, Rabbi Sher, Imam Hashmi, and Deacon Andrew Bennett for taking time out of their very, very busy schedules. Do your children get a shout out here? Not just a shout out, but their appearance. And this is the perfect time to have you here on this platform, because I just mentioned hectic schedules. So the fact that the rabbi actually had to leave the platform for a couple of minutes to get you from your bus stop, I think indicates how busy everyone is. So we've got Shlomo and Esther, and you have a young sister, right? And what's her name again? So mazel tov to you. God bless you, and many, many years of health and joy. And finally, to our viewing audience, we thank all of you for joining us and wish all of you a blessed day and a blessed life. God bless all of you.